Some churches announce themselves, towers that pierce the skyline and bells that insist upon your attention. But then there are churches like this. St Cuthbert's at Satley doesn't announce, it waits. Some places exist not merely in time, but through it, altered, eroded, rebuilt, and yet somehow more themselves for the passing of years. This is one of those places. You don't stumble upon it so much as arrive at it, and even then it feels as though it's been waiting longer than you've been coming. There's been Christian worship here since at least the early 13th century. When this place first gathered its people, England wasn't a nation of roads and schedules, but of distance and effort. The parish of Lanchester was vast, and Satley was one of its chapels of ease, a place for those who couldn't easily reach the centre. And so they came. Not in crowds, I don't think, but in ones and twos maybe, across fields, through weather, along paths that didn't forgive distraction. Faith here wasn't an abstraction to be debated, but an arrival, something walked towards, step by step, rather than merely agreed to. It had weight, it had cost, and because of that, it had form. But England, as ever, didn't remain still. The 16th century brought the Reformation, that uneasy mingling of conviction, power and human certainty. And places like this, small and rural and inconvenient, began to falter. The chapel fell into decline and disrepair, not with violence or not with spectacle, but with something far more familiar: neglect. That quiet shift where what was once lived becomes administered, and in the process, something essential is misplaced, not by force, but by indifference. And yet, it didn't end there. Because if England has a habit of forgetting, it has an equally stubborn instinct for remembering. In 1768, this church was rebuilt, not as a grand statement, but as a continuation, a body reformed around older bones, and in the centuries that followed, it was added to, adjusted, refined. A west tower and gallery in 1829 by Ignatius Bonomi, a chancel and vestry in 1870-71 by C. Hodgson Fowler, layer upon layer, which raises a quiet question one philosophers has long entertained. If something is rebuilt piece by piece, does it remain the same thing, or does its identity reside somewhere deeper than the material from which it's made? Because St Cuthbert's isn't one building, it's an accumulation, a medieval intention, a Georgian reconstruction, a Victorian completion. And beneath it all, something less easily defined. And then, of course, there's the name, St Cuthbert. St Cuthbert was no ordinary saint, nor a distant theological figure. He was a Northumbrian shepherd turned monk, bishop, hermit, a man of both solitude and duty, known as much for his gentleness with animals as for his fierce devotion. But it's not only his life that lingers in this landscape, it's his death. After he died in 687, his body didn't rest easily. It was carried by monks fleeing Viking raids. His coffin wandered for years across the north, a strange and solemn pilgrimage of bones, before finally coming to rest at Durham Cathedral, where it remains to this day. A saint who wouldn't stay still, a body that travelled until it found its place. And so his name rests here too, in this quiet corner of Durham, as if the memory of his journey had settled not only in stone, but in the very habit of the land. Look closely and you begin to see the past, not as history, but as residue. Medieval grave covers set into the walls, stones once laid over the dead now embedded in the living structure, the boundary between memory and architecture quietly dissolved. There's even a long-standing local story that at some point a vicar ordered these ancient stones destroyed, and that the church wardens, in a moment of deeply English defiance, rescued what they could and carried them away. No uprising and no drama, just a quiet refusal to let the past be erased. And perhaps that's the most honest thing about this place. Not certainty, not purity, but persistence. Inside the church is simple, although once again I couldn't get in. A modest nave, light softened through Victorian glass. The voice of a Harrison and Harrison organ, still speaking into a space that's outlived the generations who first heard it. There's no grandeur here, only continuity, and outside, the churchyard. Gravestones worn thin by time, names fading in, not into oblivion, but into something softer. And if you listen properly listen, you might hear the low conversational murmur of rooks in the nearby trees. Not harsh, as they are sometimes accused of being, but communal, watchful, almost parishioners in their own right. Creatures who remember places and return to them, which feels somehow appropriate. Because we tend to think of history as something we move beyond, as though time were a straight road and we its confident travellers. But places like this suggest something else entirely. That we don't leave the past behind at all. We build over it, we reinterpret it, we soften its edges until it becomes tolerable. And all the while it remains beneath us, within us, around us. St Cuthbert's doesn't tell you what to believe, it does something far more unsettling. It asks whether belief, like the building itself, is something we inherit, or something we quietly reconstruct, layer by layer, often without noticing what we've lost in the process. And so it waits. And yet there's something else here, something less visible and perhaps less willing to be named, because places like Satley do not simply endure, they accumulate. Every rebuilding, every restoration, every careful attempt to improve what came before, it doesn't remove the past, it covers it, softens it and makes it easier to live with. But it doesn't erase it. The stones in these walls were once laid over the dead, now they hold up the living, which isn't just history, it's a pattern. Because the human mind behaves in much the same way. What's buried isn't gone, it's only deferred. We speak often of moving forward as though time were a straight line, as though each generation leaves the last behind like a discarded coat. But we don't, we carry everything. Beliefs, doubts, compromises, even the ones we prefer not to examine, pressed quietly into the structure of who we are, layer upon layer. And like this church, we begin to forget which parts are original and which were added later. In moments of uncertainty or fear or convenience, there's something faintly theological in that. The suggestion that nothing is ever entirely lost, that what's been done, thought or believed doesn't vanish, it lingers, waiting, whether in memory, in conscience, or somewhere deeper still. So perhaps the real unease of places like St Cuthbert's isn't that they are old, but that they are honest. They don't pretend to be untouched. They don't claim purity or completion. They simply stand as they are, layered, altered, incomplete, and quietly suggest that we're much the same, not progressing cleanly into the future, but carrying the past within us, far more intact than we would like to admit. And like these stones, it's not gone, it's merely beneath. Thanks for listening, everyone. I do hope you'll come back soon. You never know what you'll find. Bye for now.